Everyone in the neighborhood called it paradise, trimmed lawns, American flags, and silence by 10 p.m. But beneath the sunshine and smiles, a different kind of law ruled the streets. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't the courts. It was the HOA police, and they didn't answer to anyone. That is, until they picked the wrong house, and the wrong woman. Because the lady in house 14? She was a retired federal judge. If you believe no one is above the law, not even those hiding behind HOA boards or fake badges, stick with this story. Because what one woman uncovered shook an entire community and exposed a system designed to keep you silent. Eleanor Marks had spent 40 years interpreting the law, sitting behind a bench where decisions shaped lives and upheld justice. By the time she retired from the federal court in Washington, D.C., her name was respected across legal circles. She wasn't flashy, never chased media attention, and didn't care for controversy. All she wanted in retirement was peace, quiet mornings, soft jazz, a garden she could tend to, and a place where no one would treat her differently because she was older or a widow. That peace seemed to present itself in the form of a gated community just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Willow Creek Estates promised safety, structure, and friendly neighbors. The day she moved in, everything looked perfect. The lawns were manicured. The trees were evenly spaced. Driveways gleamed like someone had just polished them. Children played on the sidewalks under the shade of maple trees, and the air smelled faintly of blooming roses. Her new home was a one-story brick ranch with white shutters and a wraparound porch. It wasn't grand, but it was everything she needed. She had downsized intentionally. Fewer things. Less noise. No chaos. On her second day, a cheerful woman named Brenda from the HOA knocked on her door with a welcome packet. She smiled brightly, handed over a thick folder, and assured Eleanor that Willow Creek was a close-knit community. Eleanor appreciated the gesture but found the folder unusually dense, nearly 70 pages of rules, fees, and architectural guidelines. It was more than she expected, but she chalked it up to overpreparation. After all, she believed in structure. Rules weren't inherently bad. In fact, she'd spent most of her life enforcing them. The first few days went smoothly. She met a few neighbors, received a pie from a couple down the block, and settled into a rhythm. But as she unpacked her books in the living room one afternoon, she noticed something curious outside her front window. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled slowly past her house. It didn't stop, but it wasn't moving at a normal speed either. She thought nothing of it, until it happened again the next day. Same car. Same pace. Different time. She remembered the welcome packet and flipped back to a section labeled Community Compliance. It mentioned a private security contractor hired by the HOA to ensure visual harmony and prompt enforcement of residential guidelines. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. She hadn't seen that language before. It sounded more like military jargon than neighborhood policy. She made a mental note but let it go. By the end of her first week, she received a notice on her door. It was a brightly colored slip with bold red letters, Violation, Non-Standard Mailbox Paint. Eleanor stared at it for a moment. Her mailbox was the same one from the listing photos. She hadn't touched it. It was forest green, slightly faded, but still standing straight with no rust. She opened the packet again. According to the guidelines, all mailboxes were to be painted in Willow Creek sand, a proprietary beige color available only from one hardware store 5 miles away. Failure to comply within 10 days would result in a $50 fine, increasing weekly. She didn't panic. She dealt with more serious matters. But the notice unsettled her. No one had knocked. No one had asked a question. Someone had walked up to her home, judged a mailbox, and left without a word. It was less about the paint and more about the approach. Quiet. Distant. Unchecked. Eleanor walked around the neighborhood the following afternoon, curious to see how other mailboxes looked. Some were beige, as required. Others? Not quite. She saw gray, off-white, even black. No violation slips. No red letters. Just hers. A few days later, she received another notice, this time about her backyard pergola. According to the HOA, it had not been formally approved. But the structure clearly predated her ownership, had been included in the real estate disclosures, and was visible in the Zillow listing. Still, she was told she had 15 days to submit retroactive design approval or face a fine. Eleanor began to see a pattern. The rules weren't being applied evenly. And worse, they weren't being communicated in good faith. When she called the HOA office to ask questions, she was met with vague responses. The woman on the line seemed surprised that Eleanor was pushing back at all. Most people just pay the fine, she said casually. Eleanor pressed further, asking for a copy of all recorded violations in the past month. The woman hesitated, then said, "I'm not sure we can release that kind of information." The call ended with no resolution. Eleanor hung up and sat in silence, a growing unease in her chest. She had lived through tense courtrooms, political pressure, and national media glare, but something about this little community felt darker than any of those moments. There was power here, hidden behind picket fences and flower beds, and whoever held it wasn't afraid to use it. Willow Creek Estates was peaceful on the outside, but Eleanor Marks had spent a lifetime reading between the lines. And already, she could tell, something wasn't right. Eleanor began observing her surroundings more closely. What had once seemed like an idyllic neighborhood now appeared to be carefully monitored. The same black SUV she had seen in her first week made regular loops around the block, not just once a day but multiple times, at different hours. Sometimes, it parked at the end of the cul-de-sac and sat idling for several minutes before pulling away. There was no siren, no visible markings, but the men inside wore uniforms, dark navy, with patches that read Community Compliance Task Force. At first glance, they resembled off-duty cops. Their belts carried handcuffs, radios, and stun guns. They walked with the authority of real officers, but their badges weren't from any known law enforcement agency. Their patches bore the name of a private firm, Guardian Residential Services. Eleanor made a note to research them later. What disturbed her wasn't just their presence, it was how residents reacted to them. People paused when the SUV passed. Landscapers lowered their voices. Children playing in driveways were called inside. Neighbors who had once smiled at Eleanor now seemed wary, avoiding small talk. Everyone seemed to know the unspoken rule, don't cross the HOA, and definitely don't question their security arm. The next violation notice came swiftly. This one claimed Eleanor's lawn showed signs of discoloration and cited her for failure to maintain visual standards. The grass was green, maybe slightly faded in one corner due to recent dry weather, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was mid-morning when the slip appeared, once again without warning or conversation. Eleanor had been inside the entire time and hadn't heard a knock. She checked her porch camera and saw two uniformed men walk straight to her door, tape the notice, take a picture, and leave without pause. She began hearing similar stories from a few brave neighbors. A retired teacher across the street had been fined for excessive patio decor, a pair of wind chimes and a hummingbird feeder. A young single mother had been cited for leaving her stroller on her front porch for more than 3 hours. The HOA had rules for everything, and the security team enforced them like they were criminal statutes. Eleanor took a quiet walk around the neighborhood mid-afternoon and started noticing small, metallic security signs in several yards. Each sign read, under 24-hour HOA surveillance. She counted at least 9 homes with similar signs. One of her neighbors, a man named Aaron, stood by his truck and gave her a knowing look. Eleanor approached him carefully, asking if the security team ever explained what they were doing. He shook his head and told her they didn't answer questions, they issued warnings. He had once asked for an explanation after being cited for washing his car in the driveway. In response, he received 2 more violations within a week and a threat of a lien if he didn't comply fully. As she walked away, Eleanor realized these weren't isolated incidents. The HOA was using the so-called security force to keep residents in a constant state of submission. There was no transparency, no process of appeal, and no evidence that the violations were anything more than subjective judgments made by men with no legal authority. She searched the internet that evening and found limited information about Guardian Residential Services. It was a privately owned company headquartered out of state, originally formed to provide corporate building security. In recent years, it had pivoted into residential community compliance, offering services to HOA boards that wanted enforcement without relying on local law enforcement. Their website featured staged images of uniformed men standing next to manicured lawns and words like order, harmony, control. No mention of licensing, no mention of oversight. The more she read, the clearer it became. The HOA had hired a third-party group to create the illusion of law enforcement, handing them power to patrol, issue fines, and intimidate without due process. There were no elected officials overseeing them. The board, led by a man named Martin Cray, had full discretion to direct the actions of the security force, and residents had no voice in the matter. Eleanor requested a copy of the HOA's security contract. Her formal letter was ignored. A second request received a one-line response stating that contract details were confidential to board members. That was a violation of state HOA transparency laws, but the board didn't seem concerned with legality. They had the appearance of power, and it was enough to make most homeowners fall silent. 2 days later, as Eleanor trimmed hedges in her front yard, one of the compliance officers parked nearby and stared without speaking. He remained there for over 5 minutes before slowly driving off. There was no interaction, no citation. Just presence. A quiet threat, meant to remind her that they were watching. Eleanor had faced down federal prosecutors and cross-examined CEOs. But what was happening in Willow Creek felt far more insidious. There were no courtrooms here, no cameras, no reporters, just everyday people being slowly pushed into fear, confusion, and obedience. And Eleanor Marks, even in retirement, was never one to look away from injustice. Eleanor spent her career dissecting power structures, where they concentrated, how they operated, and most importantly, how they hid. What she had seen so far in Willow Creek wasn't random. It was organized, deliberate, and calculated to keep homeowners submissive while the few at the top operated unchecked. If the HOA was just about property values and neighborhood aesthetics, it wouldn't need armed compliance officers, drone surveillance, or secrecy around contracts. This was something else entirely. Her first step was to learn who exactly sat on the HOA board. Most residents couldn't even name the full panel. Only one member, Martin Cray, appeared on any official communications. He served as both board president and the primary signatory on all violation letters. With a background in private real estate consulting, Cray had never lived in the neighborhood full-time. Records showed he owned property in Willow Creek but rented it out. He hadn't attended a single open community meeting in over a year. Cray's position gave him access to HOA funds, contract approvals, and policy decisions. Eleanor dug through county records, real estate filings, and public databases. The HOA's contract with Guardian Residential Services hadn't been reviewed publicly in over 3 years. It listed a base rate that was 40% higher than similar contracts in nearby communities. Payments were made monthly, pulled directly from the Residents Association dues, with no itemized breakdowns provided. The founder of Guardian Residential Services, Carl Denton, had a long and troubling history. A former sheriff's deputy in a neighboring county, Denton was discharged following multiple complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. Though never criminally charged, he had been the subject of 3 internal investigations and quietly resigned. Within a year, he launched his own company focused on community enforcement. His model was simple: hire underqualified ex-police officers, dress them in quasi-military uniforms, and sell compliance as peacekeeping. HOAs eager to offload enforcement duties bought in without question. In Willow Creek, the arrangement had gone far beyond code enforcement. Residents weren't just being fined, they were being watched. Security logs acquired through a whistleblower revealed that certain homeowners had recurring notations like frequent non-compliance attitude or monitor for retaliation. Some names were highlighted. Eleanor noticed patterns. Black and Latino families appeared more often. Elderly residents living alone received citations at a rate nearly double that of younger families. One log entry flagged a wheelchair ramp as a visual disruption. Another described a porch with prayer candles as religious clutter. Eleanor reached out quietly to a few residents who had received unusually aggressive notices. One of them was Tina Alvarez, a single mother of 2 who had been fined over $700 for installing a temporary ramp for her son's wheelchair. She had submitted a request beforehand but was told she'd used the wrong form and was now non-compliant. Another homeowner, Aaron Lee, had been cited 3 times in 1 month for a garden he'd maintained for years, once for overgrown herbs, once for excess use of mulch, and once for using non-standard edging material. Aaron was a military veteran who had moved to Willow Creek for its advertised safety and quiet. He now lived under constant stress, knowing the next violation could trigger a lien or legal action. The deeper Eleanor looked, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA wasn't just enforcing aesthetics, it was targeting residents who were vulnerable, less likely to fight back, or simply didn't fit the image the board wanted to maintain. Homeowners weren't just paying dues, they were funding their own surveillance and punishment. A quiet industry had grown around HOA enforcement, one that existed outside the reach of city ordinances and accountability. State laws around HOA governance were vague, and most homeowners had no idea how little protection they had until it was too late. The HOA board operated like a shadow government, writing rules, collecting penalties, and contracting with private enforcers, all without oversight. Eleanor realized this wasn't just about her mailbox, her pergola, or her grass. This was a systematic abuse of power, and it had taken root behind closed doors while the rest of the community looked the other way. It was why the fines kept increasing. Why homeowners whispered but didn't complain. Why the men in uniforms never explained themselves. With the help of Tina, Aaron, and a few others willing to speak up, Eleanor began documenting everything. Dates, violations, names, amounts. She took photos, collected letters, and organized digital records. Tina provided screenshots of harassing messages from a board email address. Aaron shared audio recordings of a compliance officer threatening to recommend legal action if his garden wasn't removed by the following week. There was no question now. The HOA was not just overreaching, it was weaponizing its authority against residents, and the private police were the muscle behind it all. Most troubling of all was how normalized it had become. People had accepted it, learned to live with it, and slowly lost the will to push back. Eleanor had spent her life ensuring the law protected those without power. She had never imagined she would be forced to do it again in retirement, in a quiet neighborhood behind hedges and cul-de-sacs. But injustice didn't always come with headlines. Sometimes, it wore a friendly smile, delivered fines by daylight, and called itself community improvement. And sometimes, all it took was one person who refused to stay silent. Word began to spread that Judge Eleanor Marks was stirring the pot. In a community trained to stay quiet, her refusal to back down was both inspiring and unsettling. Some residents whispered words of encouragement when they passed her on the sidewalk. Others kept their distance, afraid of being associated with someone challenging the board. Fear was part of the design. Retaliation wasn't an accident, it was policy. 3 days after Eleanor submitted a formal complaint to the County Housing Oversight Committee, the retaliation started. It began with her trash bins. One morning, she found them turned over, contents scattered across her driveway. At first, it looked like the work of raccoons, but the lid was cleanly snapped off, and the footage from her porch camera showed a figure in uniform walking past moments before it happened. There was no violation notice, but the message was clear. The next incident involved her utilities. A notice appeared on her front door claiming her irrigation system was causing runoff into the shared sidewalk zone. It wasn't. She hadn't even activated the sprinklers for the season. Yet the warning came with a $150 fine and a demand to halt all lawn watering activity until cleared by the HOA board. Within 48 hours, 2 more notices appeared, one accusing her of unauthorized modifications to exterior lighting and another citing unapproved wind chime frequencies. Each came with a fine. The absurdity was deliberate. They weren't just punishing her for violations, they were sending a message that resistance would be met with exhaustion. Eleanor documented everything. She printed photos, archived emails, and timestamped every violation slip. She knew how retaliation looked on paper, and she was building a record strong enough to punch through the HOA's walls of secrecy. But retaliation didn't stop at paper. One morning, she returned from the post office to find her backyard gate wide open. Her tools had been disturbed, and a pair of garden shears were missing. There was no sign of forced entry, but her camera system had gone offline for 37 minutes, right during the time she was away. A technician confirmed the outage wasn't a glitch. Someone had jammed the signal. Eleanor reported the incident to local police, but the officer who arrived took minimal notes and left without filing a report. When she followed up, she was told that property disputes involving HOAs were considered civil matters unless physical harm occurred. Other residents began experiencing strange things, too. Aaron Lee received 2 anonymous letters warning him to choose wisely who you back. Tina Alvarez woke up to find her tires slashed. The HOA denied any connection, insisting their enforcement staff acted with professionalism at all times. The official stance was always the same: no wrongdoing, no knowledge, no accountability. The fear became so palpable that several neighbors who had agreed to help Eleanor withdrew. One man, a former military contractor named Brian, left a voice message at 2 a.m. apologizing and explaining that he had a family to think about. "They know where my kids go to school," he said. "I can't afford to push this any further." The pressure worked. The community began folding in on itself. People watered their lawns obsessively. Mailboxes were double-checked for color compliance. Porch furniture vanished overnight. The HOA didn't need to say a word, its enforcers had made the consequences loud enough. Despite the growing tension, Eleanor pressed forward. She sent copies of her compiled evidence to local journalists, civil rights attorneys, and state housing boards. Most responses were slow, hesitant, or buried under bureaucratic processes. But one attorney responded immediately. Jordan Whitmore, a constitutional lawyer with experience in HOA abuse cases, expressed interest in investigating Willow Creek. Eleanor arranged a meeting. Within 24 hours of that email exchange, a black SUV parked directly in front of her home and didn't move for over 6 hours. No one exited the vehicle. It just sat there, engine idling, windows up, facing her living room. That evening, her internet cut out. The service provider claimed it was a local outage, but neighbors confirmed theirs was working fine. When the service returned, several of Eleanor's saved surveillance clips were missing. The attack wasn't just on her property. It was psychological. The HOA was telling her, in broad daylight, that she was being watched, targeted, and isolated. They wanted her to doubt herself. To grow tired. To question whether the fight was worth the risk. But for Eleanor, fear wasn't a reason to stop. It was a signal she was close to something they wanted to hide. She remembered courtrooms where power tried to mask itself in procedure, where systems wore suits and used silence as a shield. She had seen how fear ruled institutions from within. Willow Creek wasn't just a neighborhood with a strict HOA. It was a small-scale dictatorship, and the board, along with its hired enforcers, had built a machine designed to break people slowly, one violation at a time. But Eleanor Marks wasn't breaking. She was documenting. She was preparing. And the board had made one mistake: they retaliated in public. Now it was her turn. Jordan Whitmore arrived without ceremony, driving a gray sedan with no law firm branding, no assistant, and no briefcase. He didn't need theatrics. Eleanor had sent him everything: violation notices, financial records, screenshots of HOA threats, and the contract details she had obtained through leaked emails. Whitmore was a specialist in HOA overreach cases, particularly those involving unlicensed private enforcement groups. To him, Willow Creek wasn't just a community in crisis, it was a textbook case of systemic abuse dressed in community standards. The legal path forward wasn't glamorous. It didn't involve courtroom arguments or public hearings, not yet. It began with letters. Not ordinary complaint letters, but legally precise demands for transparency under state homeowners' rights laws. Whitmore submitted formal requests for financial disclosures, meeting minutes, election results, and contractor agreements. Under the law, the HOA had 10 business days to comply. When they failed to respond, he filed complaints with the state housing ombudsman, triggering quiet investigations behind the scenes. In parallel, Eleanor gathered sworn statements from the few brave residents still willing to come forward. Tina Alvarez described being threatened with foreclosure over a wheelchair ramp. Aaron Lee detailed the targeting of his backyard garden and the intimidation tactics he'd endured. They signed affidavits under penalty of perjury. Their words became more than personal stories, they became evidence. The HOA board didn't speak publicly. They issued one vague community update stating that certain individuals were attempting to disrupt the harmony of Willow Creek. But their silence behind closed doors wasn't inaction. The HOA began deleting past board meeting minutes from the community website. They pulled the contract listings offline and locked the clubhouse storage room where physical documents were kept. But Whitmore anticipated that. He filed a petition with the county civil court to preserve evidence. Within days, a quiet injunction was granted, preventing the HOA from altering or destroying financial and operational records. It wasn't headline news, but it was the first legal blow, and it landed hard. Behind the scenes, investigators began contacting former employees of Guardian Residential Services. One ex-officer admitted he had been hired with minimal background checks and no formal training. He'd been told to wear a uniform, issue violations, and never speak to residents. He confirmed the organization's methods: silent patrols, photo documentation, no questions answered. Another revealed that the company had instructed them to focus enforcement on non-compliant personality types, often identified by the board president himself. Meanwhile, Eleanor's home remained under watch. The black SUV still passed by. Her mailbox was vandalized. Her garbage wasn't picked up for 2 weeks. But none of it mattered anymore. Every act of retaliation was documented. Every phone call was logged. Every whisper of surveillance became part of a timeline Whitmore was building, a timeline of harassment, abuse of power, and HOA governance failing its duty. Then came the breakthrough. A whistleblower inside the HOA's accounting team, a part-time contractor named Linda, reached out to Whitmore anonymously. She shared documents showing that large sums of HOA dues had been diverted to a private account controlled solely by Martin Cray. The account wasn't listed on any public filings. Payments to Guardian Residential Services were being marked up by over 60%, and the overage amounts were funneled directly into that account under consulting reimbursements. The financial corruption was no longer just theoretical, it was provable, traceable, and illegal. Whitmore prepared a civil lawsuit for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and unlawful intimidation. He filed on behalf of a small group of homeowners: Eleanor, Tina, Aaron, and 2 others, citing years of systemic abuse, racial targeting, fraudulent billing, and unauthorized law enforcement impersonation. The court quietly accepted the filing. A judge signed off on an order to freeze the HOA's discretionary funds pending review. The first public notice of the lawsuit came through a certified letter delivered to each home in the neighborhood. It simply read, in the matter of Marks et al. V. Willow Creek Homeowners Association et al., residents are advised that legal action has commenced concerning HOA governance practices, contractor misuse, and resident rights violations. The response was immediate. Whispers turned to outrage. Neighbors who had kept quiet began sharing their own stories, threats over political signs, sudden fines after attending board meetings, and surveillance complaints ignored for months. Residents began organizing their own informal meetings outside HOA control. What was once fear began turning into resolve. The HOA board tried to contain the damage. They called an emergency closed meeting. They issued a newsletter assuring residents that all actions were conducted according to the bylaws. But the tide had shifted. For the first time, the board no longer controlled the narrative. The legal hammer hadn't dropped loudly. There were no sirens, no cameras, no public spectacle. It fell quietly, precisely, through the very systems the board had ignored. It fell with affidavits, injunctions, preserved documents, and frozen accounts. It didn't need to make noise, it just needed to hit the right pressure point. The lawsuit was just the beginning. Eleanor knew it. So did Whitmore. But in a neighborhood where power had hidden in uniforms and paperwork, the exposure of truth was its own kind of justice. And it was only getting started. Eleanor had always believed sunlight was the best disinfectant. And in Willow Creek, the first rays of exposure began to crack open the carefully constructed facade. The legal filing sent ripples through the community, but the real shift came when the local press picked up the story. A mid-sized online news outlet published a detailed report titled The HOA That Went Too Far, featuring anonymous sources, financial documents, and interviews with residents whose lives had been upended by the board's tactics. The story spread fast. Social media filled with outrage. Readers from across the state shared their own HOA horror stories in the comments, turning the spotlight on a broader issue hiding in plain sight. Television crews showed up quietly, filming drive-bys of the neighborhood, capturing shots of uniformed private officers patrolling cul-de-sacs. One news anchor described it as the suburban surveillance state no one asked for. The board issued a public statement calling the coverage inflammatory and one-sided, but the damage had been done. For the first time, the board members were under scrutiny. And not just from the media, state legislators began asking questions. A housing committee chair opened a preliminary inquiry into unregulated HOA enforcement contracts. The state attorney general's office requested the financials Whitmore had already submitted. The walls that had protected the board for years were finally being dismantled from the outside. Inside Willow Creek, neighbors began talking. People who had once kept their heads down started knocking on each other's doors, sharing letters, comparing fines, reviewing notices. Patterns became undeniable. Minority families received more frequent citations. Elderly homeowners were hit with higher penalties for minor infractions. Requests for accommodations due to disability or health concerns had been denied or ignored. And every complaint followed the same trail, signed by Martin Cray, processed by Guardian Residential Services, and rubber-stamped by a board few residents had ever met. A homeowners group began forming in response, unaffiliated with the board, dedicated to reclaiming transparency and control. It wasn't a protest. It was a movement. A retired accountant audited 3 years of his own fines and discovered nearly $1,200 in charges that had no supporting documentation. A high school civics teacher began organizing weekly educational meetups on HOA legal rights. Someone made a map of every house that had been fined more than 3 times in the past 2 years. The pattern exposed targeting that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. More whistleblowers emerged. A former HOA secretary anonymously released recordings of board meetings where members discussed quiet compliance strategies, referring to specific residents by name. In one clip, a board member laughed while describing the emotional breakdown of an elderly woman who begged to keep her potted plants. Another voice joked about letting Guardian handle the troublemakers. The audio spread online, triggering public condemnation and adding fuel to the legal fire. Guardian Residential Services faced mounting pressure. The company's CEO, Carl Denton, issued a vague statement defending their practices, but by then, 3 neighborhoods had terminated their contracts with the firm. A 4th HOA announced plans to sever ties within the month. Denton's entire business model, built on fear, confusion, and intimidation, was beginning to unravel. The financial freeze ordered by the court brought immediate consequences. The HOA could no longer issue new fines or collect penalties until a forensic audit was completed. Maintenance requests stacked up, emails went unanswered, and board operations came to a crawl. Some residents were frustrated by the slowdown, but most welcomed the pause. It gave them breathing room to reflect, to connect, and to understand how deeply the system had failed. For Eleanor, the shift was both gratifying and sobering. The power of exposure had changed the landscape, but it had also painted a target on her back. Anonymous letters still arrived in her mailbox, some angry, others threatening. A few called her a traitor to the neighborhood. But many thanked her. One handwritten note, tucked under her doormat, read, "You didn't just save your home. You gave the rest of us our voice back." Local politicians began responding to the momentum. A state senator introduced a bill to restrict private enforcement by HOAs and require public disclosures of all enforcement-related contracts. The bill gained unexpected bipartisan support, framed as a homeowners' rights issue. Civil liberties organizations offered pro bono support to residents affected by similar abuse. What began in Willow Creek had become a catalyst for reform far beyond its borders. The board tried to regroup, calling for a special community vote to maintain control. But turnout overwhelmed them. Hundreds of homeowners, many of whom had never participated in community decisions before, arrived in person or mailed in ballots demanding change. 3 of the 5 board members were voted out. Cray didn't even show up to defend himself. The new members promised transparency, external audits, and the immediate termination of Guardian Residential Services contract. No arrests had been made. No formal apologies issued. But for the first time in years, the community felt like it belonged to its residents again. Lawns still had rules. Mailboxes still had guidelines. But the fear was gone. The silence had been broken. And the power that once ruled in darkness had finally been dragged into the light. The lawsuit proceeded steadily, far from the noise of headlines and camera crews. Judge Eleanor Marks had no interest in a public victory, she wanted a permanent one. Her focus remained on dismantling the systems that had allowed unchecked power to flourish behind locked clubhouse doors and rubber-stamped policies. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in Eleanor's world, slow didn't mean ineffective, it meant thorough. Depositions began behind closed doors. Former HOA board members were called to testify under oath. Some arrived with lawyers, others with long, uncomfortable silences. Martin Cray, the former board president, appeared smug at first. He denied any wrongdoing, claimed all actions fell within board authority, and dismissed the intimidation complaints as exaggerated grievances. But the documents Whitmore produced during questioning left no room for interpretation: misappropriated funds, illegal contracts, and explicit memos instructing silent pressure tactics on targeted residents. Cray's smirk faded with every signature confirmed to be his. The civil court allowed the case to proceed to discovery, and what followed was a deep excavation of Willow Creek's administrative past. Internal emails revealed the HOA had used surveillance cameras not just for community safety but to track residents who attended board meetings and spoke out. One document detailed a color-coded list: green for compliant, yellow for watch list, and red for escalation. Eleanor's name had been red for 2 years. The exposure of this internal system sent shockwaves through the broader legal community. Civil rights attorneys called it a modern form of sanctioned harassment. Legal journals covered the story, calling the case a pivotal moment in redefining the limits of HOA governance. Quiet settlements began forming in the background. Residents who had suffered financial damage or emotional distress received compensation offers with confidentiality clauses. Some took the settlements. Others refused, determined to see the final verdict set a public precedent. In the midst of the legal process, structural reform began. The new HOA board members, elected in the fallout of the scandal, implemented sweeping changes. They eliminated all third-party enforcement contracts, restored fines only after due process hearings, and began hosting open forum meetings where all residents could speak freely. They repealed over 24 rules that had been weaponized to target individuals. Transparency became the new standard. Financials were posted online, votes were held publicly, and residents were given access to community records without delay or intimidation. The community began to breathe again. Yards bloomed without fear of violation. Children rode bikes past once unapproachable homes. Porch lights glowed in patterns of warmth, not suspicion. The silence that had once protected abuse now echoed with conversations, connection, and laughter. Fear had not only been defeated, it had been replaced. Eleanor declined any leadership role in the new board. Her work wasn't about control, it was about principle. Instead, she focused on advocacy beyond Willow Creek. With Whitmore's help, she spoke at legal seminars, submitted testimony to state committees, and helped draft legislation to regulate HOA enforcement powers statewide. Her quiet battle had evolved into a movement. 1 year after the first violation notice that sparked everything, the court handed down its final ruling. The HOA was found liable for financial mismanagement, abuse of authority, and systemic discrimination through targeted enforcement. Guardian Residential Services was permanently barred from contracting with any HOA in the state. Martin Cray faced civil penalties and a referral to the state bar for ethical violations in his role as a licensed property manager. He resigned from all community associations and quietly disappeared from public view. No dramatic arrests. No handcuffs on doorsteps. Just rulings. Penalties. Bans. Restrictions. Permanent entries in court records and state registries. The kind of justice that doesn't shout, but cannot be undone. The settlement fund provided restitution to over 30 residents, including elderly homeowners who had paid thousands in unlawful fees, and families who had nearly lost their homes to foreclosure over fabricated violations. Some of that money went into creating a legal aid fund for residents of other HOA communities facing similar issues. Eleanor's name appeared on the foundation paperwork, not as a donor, but as a founding advocate. Change didn't arrive all at once. But it did arrive. Other neighborhoods began auditing their own boards. State regulators launched reviews of HOA contracts statewide. The legislation inspired by Willow Creek passed with bipartisan support and became law within 9 months. It required transparency, limited the scope of enforcement, and banned anonymous violations. The era of silent oppression behind manicured lawns was coming to an end. Justice, Eleanor always believed, wasn't a moment, it was a process. One that demanded persistence, courage, and an unwavering belief that systems must serve the people who live under them. Willow Creek would never forget the fear that once ruled it, but more importantly, it would never forget the quiet revolution that reclaimed it. And long after the lawsuits ended, the story of a retired judge who refused to be silenced continued to inspire others to stand up, speak out, and believe in the permanent power of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. They thought silence would protect their power. They thought fear would keep the truth buried. But they underestimated one woman, and the courage of a community that finally refused to look away. Willow Creek didn't just win a lawsuit. They reclaimed their dignity. They exposed the abuse. They changed the law. And they proved something we all need to remember. Real justice doesn't always come in sirens or headlines. Sometimes, it comes in the quiet resolve of someone who simply won't back down. If you found this story powerful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you or someone you know is facing HOA abuse, speak up. Because you are not alone, and you are not powerless. This isn't just a story. It's a warning. And a wake-up call. Thanks for watching.